March 1941, a time when the world trembled on the edge of chaos. Armies marched. Alliances shifted. And the fate of millions hung on decisions made by a few powerful men. In the East, one man, Joseph Stalin, stood at the center of a storm that was rapidly closing in. His spies whispered the truth. Germany was preparing to invade the Soviet Union. Their reports were clear, precise, and terrifying. Yet Stalin, the man who prided himself on his paranoia, refused to believe them. Instead, he dismissed the evidence as lies, British propaganda designed to sow mistrust between Moscow and Berlin. In his Hitler would never betray the non-aggression pact they had signed less than 2 years before. But the reality was very different. Across the border, German divisions were already on the move, their tanks and troops amassing in secret. The wolves were gathering, and Stalin, blinded by his own certainty, was leaving the door wide open. What makes this moment so haunting is not just Stalin's mistake, but the tragic irony of it. The very intelligence network he had built through fear and secrecy gave him the answers he needed. Yet his own fear of being deceived caused him to ignore them. His spies, his generals, even foreign diplomats all tried to warn him, but each warning was brushed aside, each truth buried beneath the weight of his disbelief. It is a story of power, pride, and the catastrophic cost of ignoring the truth. Because sometimes, the greatest threat is not the enemy at your border, it is the voice inside your head telling you that you are too clever to be fooled. In this episode, we will uncover how Stalin's denial shaped one of the most devastating chapters of World War I. We will explore the intelligence failures, the men who tried to speak the truth, and the growing storm that would soon erupt into Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. If you are fascinated by the hidden battles of World War I, the spies, the secrets, and the decisions that changed the course of history, then you are in the right place. Make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you do not miss any of our future stories. Every week, we bring history to life, revealing not just what happened, but why it mattered. Because history is not just about dates and battles, it is about choices, consequences, and the fragile line between truth and denial. So sit and let us travel back to 1941, to the days when the Soviet leader's disbelief would help shape the fate of the world. While Stalin dismissed the warnings coming from his spies, far to the south another battle was unfolding, a clash that would prove how fragile human judgment can be in times of war. In the mountains of northern Greece, the air was thick with smoke and snow, and the cries of exhausted soldiers echoed through the ridges of Hill 371. It was March 1941, and Mussolini, desperate to restore Italy's pride after months of humiliation, had ordered a renewed offensive against Greece. He had promised his generals a quick and decisive victory, but what followed was a scene of misery, courage, and futility that mirrored the very arrogance shaping Europe's fate. The Italian campaign in Greece had begun as an attempt to rival Germany's dominance within the Axis, but it had turned into a nightmare. The men sent to fight were ill-prepared for the bitter cold of the mountains, their supply lines strained and their morale fading. Facing them were Greek troops who fought not for conquest, but for survival. Every inch of ground was soaked with determination. They fought in tattered uniforms, often with limited ammunition, but their spirit refused to break. At Hill 371, this determination reached its peak. For days, the Italians launched wave after wave of assaults up the rocky slopes. Artillery thundered. Shells carved deep scars into the earth, and the hillsides turned into mud and fire. Yet every time they reached the crest, the Greeks counterattacked with ferocity. The fighting was so brutal, so close, that soldiers could hear the breath of the enemy. Hand-to-hand combat raged in the trenches, and the mountain itself seemed to tremble under the weight of the struggle. Those who witnessed it later compared it to Verdun, a place where courage met madness and neither could claim victory. By the middle of March, the toll was staggering. 12,000 Italian soldiers were killed or wounded, their efforts shattered against the stubborn Greek defense. Mussolini himself visited the front, standing among his troops as if his presence could reverse the tide. But even the Deus theatrics could not mask the truth. His army was bleeding for nothing. The Greeks, though victorious, were not untouched by the cost. Their ammunition stores were dangerously low, their men exhausted beyond measure, their strength stretched thin. Hill 371 became both a triumph and a warning, a symbol of resistance that carried within it the seeds of future vulnerability. Behind the front lines, Greece leaders celebrated their nation's bravery, but they knew the situation was dire. Every victory drained their limited supplies, and every day of resistance invited a greater storm from the north. The Germans were watching closely, and for them, the Italian failure was an opportunity. Hitler, who had once mocked Mussolini's ambitions, now saw the Balkans as a necessary path to secure his southern flank before turning east. The German war machine was already moving through Bulgaria, assembling divisions and armored columns that would soon descend upon Greece with terrifying precision. As the Greek soldiers dug in around their mountain positions, they had little idea of the scale of what was coming. The smoke had barely cleared from Hill 371 when reconnaissance planes began to appear overhead, sleek, grey shapes cutting across the sky, scouting the terrain for a new invasion. The Italians, though humiliated, had unwittingly paved the way for their German allies to intervene. For the exhausted Greeks, the lull between battles was not a reprieve but the quiet before an even greater storm. And while this played out in Moscow, Stalin's disbelief continued. The irony was almost cruel. Across the continent, nations were falling victim not only to their enemies but to their own misjudgments. In Greece, Mussolini's vanity had cost thousands of lives and left his country dependent on German aid. In the Soviet Union, Stalin's pride was blinding him to the signs of betrayal gathering along his western border. Both men were prisoners of their own certainty, and both would soon face consequences beyond anything they imagined. The Battle of Hill 371 did more than test the courage of soldiers. It revealed the psychological strain of leadership under pressure. Mussolini's decision to attack Greece, despite his generals' doubts, was driven by a need to prove Italy's power. When the plan failed, he refused to retreat, fearing that to admit defeat would mean political disaster. So he kept sending men into the mountains, chasing an illusion of victory until the mountains themselves seemed to swallow his army. For the Greeks, victory came at a terrible price. They had defended their homeland with honor, but their army was now depleted and scattered. They had no time to rest, no time to recover. Their rifles were worn, their artillery pieces short of shells, and their supply routes overstretched. Yet even as they buried their dead, they held their heads high. To them, Hill 371 was proof that courage could defy the odds, even against a larger, wealthier enemy. But beneath that pride lay exhaustion, and exhaustion in war is a dangerous thing. In the weeks that followed, the Italian front grew eerily quiet. Mussolini, humiliated, finally ordered the offensive to halt. The snow-covered slopes were littered with the remnants of his failure: twisted metal, frozen rations, and unburied bodies. The Greeks, battered but unbroken, stood victorious on their hard-won ground. They had faced one storm and survived, unaware that the next one, carrying the full might of the German army, was already forming beyond the horizon. The story of Hill 371 is not just a tale of battle. It is a mirror reflecting the human flaws that shape history. Pride, fear, and denial, these were the unseen forces that guided decisions as much as strategy and firepower. And as Europe burned, those same forces would soon lead the world into an even darker chapter. As the snows of March 1941 began to melt, Europe was trembling beneath the weight of decisions made behind closed doors. In the Balkans, where mountains met the sea and loyalties were as shifting as the spring winds, one man found himself trapped between two impossible forces. Prince Paul of Yugoslavia, regent to a fragile kingdom, faced a choice that would not only determine his country's fate, but also ignite the fury of his own people. The Axis powers loomed like thunderclouds to the north and west. Hitler's armies had swept through Poland, Norway, France, and now stood poised to descend on the Balkans. To the east, the Soviet Union watched in wary silence. To the south, the British clung desperately to their footholds in Greece and the Mediterranean. Yugoslavia was surrounded, its neutrality a thread stretched to breaking. Prince Paul was no tyrant, no firebrand. He was an intellectual aristocrat, a man who preferred books and art to war and bloodshed. Yet in this moment, diplomacy offered him no safety. Every day brought new warnings from Berlin. German envoys reminded him that refusal to join the Axis meant invasion. They spoke politely, but the threat was unmistakable. Hitler wanted Yugoslavia's cooperation for his coming campaign against Greece. German troops already occupied neighboring Bulgaria, and their tanks were massing near the border. If Yugoslavia resisted, it would be crushed. In Belgrade, the streets hummed with tension. Government ministers argued behind heavy oak doors, their voices echoing in the corridors of power. Some urged defiance, believing the army could resist long enough for Britain to intervene. Others, wary of bloodshed and aware of the destruction that had already consumed Europe, argued that survival demanded compromise. For days, Prince Paul listened to both sides, his conscience torn between duty to his people and fear of annihilation. On March 25, 1941, he made his decision. In Vienna, representatives of the Yugoslav government signed the Tripartite Pact, formally aligning their country with the Axis powers. It was a decision made under unbearable pressure, but one Paul hoped might preserve Yugoslavia's sovereignty at least for the moment. The ink was barely dry before the news reached Belgrade. What followed was not relief, but outrage. Across the capital, the people erupted in protest. Crowds poured into the streets, waving flags, singing patriotic songs, and shouting defiance at Germany. Students, soldiers, and ordinary citizens marched together beneath the shadow of the royal palace. The Axis banners that had been hung in celebration were torn down and burned. Graffiti bloomed overnight on the city's walls, messages of resistance scrawled in haste and anger. The people had not been consulted, and they would not be silenced. Inside the government, chaos followed. Ministers who had supported the pact resigned in disgust, unable to face the fury of the nation. Others fled, fearing retribution from the enraged populace. The regency itself began to crumble as confidence in Prince Paul evaporated. To many Yugoslavs, he was now a symbol of submission, a man who had bartered away the honor of the nation to appease a foreign tyrant. Yet in truth, Paul's motives had been more complex. He knew Yugoslavia could not withstand the might of the German war machine. He hoped, perhaps naively, that diplomacy might delay the inevitable, buying time for his country to prepare or for the tides of war to shift. But the world had little mercy left to give. In Berlin, Hitler's patience was already thinning. The protests in Belgrade were seen not as an expression of national pride, but as an act of betrayal. To him, Yugoslavia was a pawn that had to be controlled before he could strike at Greece and Beyond it, the Soviet Union. Plans were hastily drawn for invasion. Yet even as those orders were drafted, events inside Yugoslavia took another dramatic turn. On March 27th, just 2 days after the pact was signed, the military struck. A group of Air Force officers, fueled by patriotism and courage, launched a coup d'état. They stormed government buildings, arrested pro-Axis officials, and declared 17-year-old King Peter I as the new ruler. Prince Paul was forced into exile, his years of careful diplomacy undone overnight. Belgrade once again roared with celebration, this time not in anger, but in triumph. Crowds flooded the streets, chanting the young king's name and waving British and Soviet flags side by side. They believed the coup had saved their honor, that Yugoslavia had reclaimed its independence and defied the will of Hitler himself. But beneath the jubilation, darker consequences were already unfolding. Hitler's rage was immediate and absolute. The rebellion in Belgrade, he declared, must be crushed without mercy. Within hours, he ordered the Wehrmacht to prepare for a full-scale invasion of Yugoslavia. What began as a political maneuver had now become a death sentence for an entire nation. As the coup leaders scrambled to fortify their defenses, German divisions rolled south from Austria and Hungary. The skies over Belgrade would soon be filled with bombers, and the dream of independence would be drowned in fire. Prince Paul, watching from exile, could only reflect on the cruel irony of it all. His decision to sign the pact had been meant to save Yugoslavia from destruction. Instead, it had sparked the very catastrophe he had feared. In the grand, shifting theater of World War, Yugoslavia's brief moment of defiance was both heroic and tragic. It showed the world that even small nations could stand up to tyranny, but also how swiftly hope could be extinguished when surrounded by powers far greater than themselves. The Balkan storm had broken, and the fires it unleashed would burn across the region, setting the stage for one of the most brutal invasions of the war. Far from the turmoil in the Balkans and the bitter snows of Europe, the North African desert shimmered beneath a merciless sun. Here, war moved differently. There were no trenches, no forest to hide in, only endless waves of sand, wind, and heat. It was a battlefield where machines could vanish beneath the dunes, and strategy depended as much on mirage as on metal. And in early 1941, into this vast expanse rode a man whose name would soon become legend: Erwin Rommel, the desert fox. When Rommel arrived in Tripoli, his orders were clear: defend. Germany had sent him not to conquer, but to stabilize the situation after Italy's humiliating defeats in the region. Mussolini's grand dream of an Italian empire in Africa had crumbled quickly under British counterattacks. Leaving his armies in disarray, Cyrenaica had fallen, and what remained of Italy's colonial forces clung desperately to the western edges of Libya. Rommel's task was to hold the line, to protect Tripoli, and to give the Axis powers a foothold in North Africa. But Rommel was not a man content with waiting. From the moment he stepped off the plane, dust swirling around his boots, he saw not a static defense but an opportunity. His instincts, honed on the battlefields of France the year before, told him that speed and surprise were his greatest allies. The British, though victorious, were stretched thin across hundreds of miles of desert. Their supply lines were fragile, their tanks worn by sand and distance. They had won battles, but they had also overextended themselves. Rommel studied their positions like a chessboard. Intelligence reports confirmed what his eyes already saw. The British Eighth Army was exhausted and poorly reinforced. Cairo and Alexandria, the jewels of British control in the Middle East, lay far to the east, but between them and the Axis front was a desert that could either consume armies or carry them to glory. Rommel chose the latter. He began to move his forces with quiet precision, ignoring the cautious instructions from Berlin. He inspected his troops personally, driving his command car across the dunes, standing tall in his open vehicle, his field goggles gleaming in the sun. To his men, he was a symbol of energy and confidence. A commander who led from the front and shared their hardships. The Italian soldiers, weary and demoralized, found in him a renewed sense of purpose. He reorganized their ranks, repaired what he could, and prepared for what his superiors had not yet authorized, a full offensive eastward. Across Cyrenaica, toward Egypt. In late March 1941, as Europe watched the Balkans erupt and Yugoslavia teeter toward disaster, Rommel made his move. His tanks, the sleek Panzer IS, surged forward under the desert moon. The offensive began with reconnaissance probes, small and swift, testing the British defenses. The enemy, believing the Axis forces too weak for any major action, dismissed these movements as minor skirmishes. But by the time they realized the scale of Rommel's advance, it was already too late. The attack struck with astonishing speed. British outposts were overrun one by one, their commanders stunned by the ferocity and coordination of the assault. The desert, once their ally, now betrayed them. Supply convoys were cut off, communication lines snapped, and units found themselves isolated in the endless sand. Rommel's tactics, swift encirclements, feints, and lightning strikes turned the terrain itself into a weapon. To his enemies, it seemed as though he appeared everywhere at once, a phantom moving through the dunes. Back in London, military planners struggled to understand how a force so small could achieve so much. In truth, Rommel's genius lay not in numbers but in audacity. He understood that in the desert, speed was everything. Where the British hesitated, he advanced. Where they fortified, he bypassed. His tanks moved by night, his supply trucks disguised by day. Every attack was a gamble, every victory bought with risk, but Rommel believed that boldness, executed swiftly, could turn weakness into strength. As his troops pushed eastward, capturing towns and airfields with breathtaking momentum, British forces fell back toward Tobruk, a port city that would soon become one of the most fiercely contested strongholds of the war. There, the British dug in, determined to hold their ground at any cost. For them, Tobruk was not just a military position but a symbol of defiance. For Rommel, it was an obstacle standing between him and the open road to Egypt. His confidence grew with each success, but so too did the scale of his ambition. Though he still received telegrams from Berlin reminding him to stay defensive, he ignored them entirely. To him, war was not won by waiting for permission, it was won by seizing the moment. And in those months of 1941, the desert seemed to conspire with him. Sandstorms blinded reconnaissance planes, the sun burned away hesitation, and the horizon promised endless possibilities. Yet beneath the brilliance of his maneuvers lay a fatal flaw, one that would haunt the Axis campaign in North Africa from the beginning to the end. Supply. Every mile Rommel advanced stretched his logistics thinner. Fuel, ammunition, food, all had to be brought across the same vast deserts he sought to conquer. The British, though retreating, knew this and planned to exploit it. For now, however, their exhaustion outweighed their strategic foresight. They were reeling, regrouping, and fighting for survival. By April, Rommel had driven the British forces nearly back to the Egyptian frontier. His victories stunned the world. Newspapers in Berlin celebrated the rise of the Desert Fox, while Churchill's cabinet in London faced growing unease. The war in North Africa, once thought secure, had suddenly turned into a desperate struggle. As the sun set over the dunes, casting long shadows across the battlefield, Rommel stood at the edge of his advance, the wind whipping against his uniform. Behind him lay the wreckage of British vehicles half buried in sand. Ahead, the endless desert stretched toward Egypt, He had defied his orders, challenged the odds, and changed the balance of the war in Africa, all through sheer will and speed. But as with all bold gambles, the price would come later. For now, under the blazing North African sky, victory seemed as boundless as the desert itself, and Rommel's legend had only just begun. While Rommel's tanks carved trails of fire through the sands of North Africa, another kind of struggle was unfolding thousands of miles away. One fought not in deserts, but in the rugged mountains of East Africa and the deep valleys of China. The global war had stretched across continents, and though Europe's great powers dominated the headlines, battles in these distant regions were no less fierce, no less violent. Here, soldiers from lands far apart fought side by side against the same dark tide of aggression, their courage echoing across landscapes that few at home would ever see. In the highlands of Eritrea, where the air was thin and the rocks sharp as knives, Nigerian and Indian troops pressed their advance through narrow passes and jagged ridges. Their target was Marta Pass and the fortress town of Keren, key strongholds of the Italian defense in East Africa. The Italians had dug in deep, turning the mountains into a labyrinth of bunkers and gun nests. Their pride was wounded after a string of defeats. This was their last true stand in the region. They knew that if Keren fell, the entire Italian East African Empire would collapse. The British command understood that as well. For months, supply convoys snaked through desert roads and steep mountain trails to bring men and munitions to the front. The heat by day was unbearable, the cold at night bone deep, but the men pressed on. Africans, Indians, and Europeans fighting together under the same flag. They came not for conquest, but to drive out an occupier who had long treated East Africa as a playground for imperial ambition. At Mardas, the fighting was brutal. Artillery thundered across the valleys, and the air filled with dust and smoke. The slopes were so steep that tanks could barely move, forcing soldiers to fight hand-to-hand among the rocks. Nigerian troops led daring assaults up the cliffs, their determination breaking through Italian lines that had once seemed impregnable. Nearby, Indian regiments, veterans of mountain warfare, climbed through ravines under constant fire, outflanking the defenders and cutting off their retreat. For days the battle raged without rest. The Italians, though cornered, fought with desperate valor. Yet the pressure mounted, and the combined Allied forces began to close the noose. When the final push came, it was swift and merciless. Italian positions crumbled, their guns silenced one by one. The defenders who survived fled deeper into the mountains, leaving behind a shattered army and a trail of broken artillery. When Keren finally fell, the victory was not just military, it was symbolic. It marked the end of Italian dominance in East Africa, and with it, the liberation of lands long trapped under foreign rule. As British columns raised their flags over the captured ridges, the world's attention shifted eastward, to another battleground half a world away. In China, where the war had already raged for nearly 4 years, Japanese forces were launching yet another offensive, this time at Shanghai, in the province of Jiangxi. The Japanese High Command sought a quick and decisive victory to break Chinese morale. But what awaited them was not a retreating army, but a nation that had learned to endure and resist with unyielding resolve. The battle for Shanghai began under heavy artillery fire. Japanese troops advanced with precision, their tanks rumbling through the countryside, supported by waves of infantry. The Chinese defenders, under the command of General Chu Yu, refused to yield. They fought from trenches and farmhouses, from hilltops and river banks, using the terrain to their advantage. Every advance the Japanese made was met with ambushes and counterattacks. The struggle became one of attrition. Days turned to weeks, and the battlefield became a landscape of ruin. Supply lines stretched thin, and as the Japanese pressed forward, Chinese guerrillas struck deep behind their lines. Supply convoys were ambushed, railways sabotaged, bridges blown apart, The carefully planned offensive began to falter under the weight of its own logistics. In the swamps and rice fields, Japanese troops found themselves trapped, their armored columns bogged down, their soldiers exhausted and hungry. What the Japanese had underestimated was the adaptability of their opponents. The Chinese forces had learned hard lessons from years of brutal warfare. They no longer fought solely in open battles. They blended conventional and guerrilla tactics, turning every village, every forest, into a trap. The morale of the defenders was unbroken, sustained by a fierce belief that this was not just another campaign, it was a fight for survival, for the right to exist as a free nation. When the battle finally ended, it was not with a sweeping victory for the invaders, but with their retreat. The Japanese, unable to maintain their supply routes and faced with mounting losses, pulled back from Shanghai. For China, it was a rare but deeply significant triumph. In the midst of devastation, it proved that even a war-ravaged nation could stand firm against one of the most formidable armies in the world. Meanwhile, reports of these victories at Keren in Africa and Shanghai in China began to circulate among the Allied leaders. They were small compared to the vast movements of armies in Europe, but they carried a powerful message. The Axis forces could be resisted, their advance halted by courage and unity. From the mountains of Eritrea to the river valleys of Jiangxi, men who spoke different languages and came from distant lands were fighting the same enemy, bound by the same hope that aggression would not prevail forever. As March 1941 drew to a close, the war was spreading faster than ever, its fronts stretching from the deserts of Libya to the jungles of Asia. Yet within that chaos, the world was beginning to see the first glimmers of a truth that would one day define the outcome. That victory did not belong to those who struck first or hardest, but to those who endured, adapted, and refused to yield. In the silence that followed the guns at Keren and Shanghai, that lesson was written across the mountains and the fields in the language of sacrifice, defiance, a promise that even in the darkest hours, resistance was not in vain. As the smoke of war spread across continents, from the deserts of North Africa to the mountains of Yugoslavia and the rivers of China, the Atlantic Ocean remained the silent, endless front of the global struggle. Beneath its cold waves, unseen and unforgiving, the Battle of the Atlantic raged, a war of shadows between the hunters and the hunted. For nearly 2 years, Germany's U-boats had ruled those waters, striking terror into Allied convoys and threatening to sever the vital lifeline between America and Britain. But in March 1941, that reign of fear began to falter. The hunters were about to become the hunted. Germany's submarine arm, the Kriegsmarine's proudest weapon, was led by men whose names carried an almost mythical weight among their comrades. Otto Kretschmer, Joachim Schepke, and Prien were more than captains, they were heroes of the Reach, symbols of precision, courage, and relentless success. The U-boats had sunk dozens of ships, crippling Allied shipping and earning them decorations from Hitler himself. They represented the sharp edge of Germany's maritime power, the spear that had kept Britain gasping for breath. But in the first months of 1941, that spear began to break. One by the sea claimed its champions. First came Prien, the famed bull of Scapa Flow, whose daring raid on the British fleet in 1939 had turned him into a national legend. In early March, his U-47 disappeared in the North Atlantic after attacking a convoy. Whether destroyed by depth charges or caught in an underwater explosion, no one knew for certain. Only silence remained where once his victories had echoed. Then, days later, Joachim Schepke met the same fate. His U-100 was detected by radar, a new and deadly British innovation, and rammed and sunk. Schepke's body was never recovered. The final blow came swiftly after. Otto Kretschmer, the most successful submarine commander in German history, was captured when his U-99 was destroyed after a fierce battle with British destroyers. He and his surviving crew were taken prisoner. In a matter of weeks, Germany's 3 most celebrated naval heroes were gone, 1 dead, 1 missing, and 1 a prisoner of war. For the men of the Kriegsmarine, it was more than a loss of commanders. It was the shattering of a legend. The news hit Germany like a wave of grief. In naval bases along the Baltic coast, young submarine crews read the reports in stunned silence. The photographs of smiling captains in crisp uniforms, once displayed proudly in barracks and newspapers, now carried the weight of tragedy. The myth of invincibility that had surrounded the U-boat force was gone. The sea, it seemed, had turned against them. At the same time, in the quiet offices of the British Admiralty, there was no celebration, only grim satisfaction. The Royal Navy knew that these victories had come at a cost, but they also knew what they meant. The tide was turning. Advances in sonar and convoy tactics were finally beginning to blunt the edge of the U-boat threat. The ocean that had once been Germany's hidden weapon was now becoming its graveyard. In Berlin, Hitler raged at the losses. His faith in his submarine commanders had been near absolute. Their destruction shook him deeply. Orders were given to redouble U-boat production, to find new heroes to fill the void. But among the surviving sailors, something vital had been lost: the belief that they were untouchable. Each patrol now carried not just the danger of the enemy, but the shadow of uncertainty. Every man who boarded a submarine knew that the odds of returning were shrinking. And yet, even in defeat, these events revealed something profound about the nature of the war itself. The oceans, like the deserts and mountains, cared nothing for ideology or glory. They were great equalizers, testing the courage and endurance of all who dared to fight upon them. The fall of Germany's greatest U-boat aces was not just a military setback. It was a reminder of the fragility of human ambition in the face of an unforgiving world. As spring turned to summer, the conflict raged on. In the east, Stalin still refused to believe the storm that was coming. In the Balkans, Yugoslavia had fallen into chaos. In North Africa, Rommel's scandal was just beginning to unfold. And across the world's oceans, the war beneath the waves continued, silent, merciless, and unending. But for Germany's navy, March 1941 would always mark the moment when the tide of fortune began to recede. The loss of Kretschmer, Schepke, and Prien was more than a blow to strategy. It was a turning point in morale, a sign that even the most disciplined and daring could be undone by fate. Technology and time, their legend would live on, but their deaths signaled that the war's balance was beginning to shift. The Allies were adapting, learning, evolving, and the age of unchecked German dominance at sea was drawing to a close. History often remembers the grand victories, the sweeping offensives, the cities captured, the empires that rose and fell. But sometimes, the true turning points lie hidden beneath the waves, in the silent struggles that decide who controls the lifelines of the world. The deaths of Germany's top submarine commanders in March 1941 were such a moment, an invisible fracture in the heart of the Axis war machine. From that point forward, the Atlantic would become not a hunting ground, but a graveyard of ambition. Thank you for watching this story and exploring one of the most dramatic months of World War I with us. If you enjoyed this journey through history, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss what comes next. Every week, we uncover the hidden chapters of the past where courage, tragedy, and fate collide to shape the world we live in today.